Summer 1942. The sun beats down mercilessly on the vast expanse of the Egyptian desert. The horizon dances like a flickering fire in the 50-degree heat. The sand is hot, and the breeze blowing from the west carries nothing but dust and the taste of metal and gasoline. In the heart of this merciless desert, two armies line up against each other. In the west, the German and Italian field armies, commanded by General Erwin Rommel, the man who became known as the Desert Fox, are reviewing another offensive plan with sharp eyes and a lightning mind. In the east, the British 8th Army, fresh from successive defeats in North Africa, is rebuilding its morale and defenses. But now something is changed in the air. The British have appointed a new general to command. A quiet, cautious, and unassuming man, but with a faith in victory, Bernard Law Montgomery. In his command tent, near the front line, Montgomery has a map spread out on a metal table, tracing the enemy lines with a red pencil, and says, "If we fail here, Egypt falls, and if Egypt falls, we lose the Suez Canal. And without Suez, the British Empire is cut off. This is the end of the line, gentlemen." Silence falls in the tent, the sound of a generator outside, and the smell of oil in the air. Montgomery looks up, tells his officers, "We will stay at El Alamein, to the last man. There is no retreat here." Meanwhile, across the desert, Rommel sits in his command jeep, holding a telescope to his eyes. He looks out at the horizon, where the British are building new trenches. Beside him, a German officer says, "General, we are running low on fuel. Supplies are coming in with difficulty from Tripoli, and enemy planes are blocking the way." "I am not afraid of a lack of fuel," Rommel smiles. "They are afraid of me. We will attack before they are ready." In the silence of the night, two worlds lie opposite each other, east and west. Two tired but determined forces, two commanders with different philosophies. Montgomery wants to defeat the enemy on his own turf, by plan, by calculation, by discipline. Rommel wants to win by boldness and speed and surprise, by instinct and fire. That night, in the tents, a murmur of prayer can be heard among the British soldiers. The soldiers light cigarettes, whisper the name of their home, and stare into the starless sky. On the other side, German soldiers work in silence, adjusting the engines of panzer tanks and oiling the gears. The next day dawns, and hell begins. The documentary camera slowly rises from the horizon. The sky turns red, the sound of tank engines roars in the distance, and the ground trembles under the iron wheels. The Battle of El Alamein is coming.
The sound of artillery drums still echoed in my ears. The night, the sky of El Alamein was ablaze, and for a few hours the world forgot the meaning of silence. The ground shook. The air was saturated with gunpowder. The blast waves could be felt for tens of kilometers, and the sky was filled with orange and red light, as if stars had fallen and were burning in the sand. At 0200 on the night of October 23, 1942, British and Allied forces began their largest artillery operation on the African front. More than 1,000 guns opened fire simultaneously. This was the beginning of Operation Lightfoot, a name Montgomery had chosen sarcastically because his infantrymen had to lightfoot through enemy minefields to clear the way for the tanks. The documentary camera pans over the desert from above. Trails of fire and smoke are drawn like red and gray lines across the ground. Each explosion point, a new hole in the sand. The narrator's voice is calm and heavy. That night, the land of El Alamein was no longer lifeless. Every grain of sand was alive under the pressure of steel and fire. No one knew who would live until morning. On the front line, British engineering teams silently approached the enemy minefields. Each team advanced in pitch darkness with minesweepers, shovels, and lanterns covered in black cloth. Every click of a mine heralded death. A young soldier named Alan Richards later wrote in his memoirs, "Every time we saw a mine, we would defuse it with bated breath. Every sound of a tank engine, every gust of wind would be the last thing we would hear." Behind them, endless rows of tanks stood waiting for the path to open. Lights off, engines off, just the sound of beating hearts and the soft sound of sand under steel wheels. Amidst this line, Major John Bradley, radio in hand, said, "Move whenever you hear me. Don't move before then. We'll break them tonight or we'll be buried here." Across the desert, in the German camp, the attack, though not unexpected, shocked everyone. The horizon was a wall of blazing fire. General Wilhelm Stamm, who was in command in Rommel's absence, rushed out of the tent. "General, the eastern lines are under full fire. They're pressing the northern flank," the guard officer shouted. Stamm spread the map on the jeep, and in the light of his flashlight, his gaze fell on the Italian defenses, the Ariete Division. He knew that if they broke, the entire southern flank would collapse. But Stamm was a man of hesitation, not action. He did not know that Montgomery had deliberately concentrated the fire on the northern flank to distract the Germans from the main attack in the center. Rommel was in a hospital in Germany at the time. When he heard of the attack, he immediately requested to return. "I cannot stay here while my men are fighting in that hell," he told the doctor. A few hours later, he was sitting in a Ju-52 on his way back to the Egyptian desert. In the desert, the battle continued. The first wave of British infantry had suffered heavy casualties. Mines, barbed wire, and accurate German gunfire had slowed the advance. But behind them, the Allied artillery was relentless. The ground shook and the sky was filled with smoke. In the light of the explosions, the Sherman and Grant tanks, their armor gleaming, moved slowly forward. Hot sand burned beneath the sand pits, and the smell of hot metal and rubber permeated the air. Montgomery stood in the command post. The sound of radios, reports, and shouts echoed through the air. He was calm, in contrast to the chaos around him. He stubbed out his cigarette and said, "Don't give them a chance to rebuild. Every inch of ground must be conquered by bullets." At dawn on the second day, the golden sun rose through the smoke and fog. The landscape of the El Alamein desert was no longer a plain. It was an apocalyptic landscape. Burnt tanks, half buried in the sand, trucks with blackened bodies, and the roar of engines still trying to escape death. Thirsty soldiers, their faces covered in dust and sweat, crawled out of their makeshift shelters. No one knew which side of the front was safer. That same day, Rommel returned to the front. His plane landed in a sandstorm. He dismounted, dressed in khaki and with a pale face. The officers stood to pay their respects. "Don't look back," Rommel said. "We must stop the enemy here, or never." He got into his command jeep and headed for the front line. On the way, he passed rows of destroyed tanks and wounded. There was a heavy silence between him and his officer. There is no more honor, only survival. Rommel muttered. By noon on the third day of the battle, the temperature had reached 50 degrees. The sand was so hot that boots melted. Water had become the goldest thing in the world. Each soldier had a limited ration, and many did not dare use a drop to wash their wounds. In this hell, the battle continued. The artillery did not tire. Both sides gained and lost ground, meter by meter. In the afternoon, Montgomery learned from reconnaissance planes that Rommel had prepared his forces for a counterattack. He said calmly, "Let it come. I am waiting for it." That evening, German panzers rose from the dust. Their ranks moved like steel snakes through the sand. The roar of their engines shook the air. The German counterattack began. But Montgomery was ready. Dozens of British 6-pounders and 17-pounder guns were hidden in the surrounding hills. As the panzers came into range, the ground beneath them suddenly exploded. The first column was destroyed. One German tank crew later wrote, "I have never seen such a storm of iron. The bullets were boiling from the ground. There was no way to retreat." Rommel, watching the scene from a distance in his jeep, gritted his teeth and said, "This man is more accurate than I thought." By the evening of the 5th, the battle had reached a stalemate. Neither side was backing down. The ground was covered with corpses, iron, and fire. Of the hundreds of tanks, only a few remained intact. In Rommel's camp, fuel shortages had become a deadly crisis. Italian convoys in the Mediterranean had been destroyed by Allied air power. Hungry soldiers, tanks immobile, and a commander who knew the game was up. A cold silence reigned in Rommel's tent. He wrote in his notebook, "This is no longer war, it is survival. The sun is our enemy, the earth is our enemy, and time is our enemy." But across the front, Montgomery was still calm. He smiled and said, "Tomorrow is the time. We begin the second phase, Operation Supercharge." And with that, the third act of the Battle of El Alamein was underway, where the fate of Rommel and the British Empire would be decided in the sands of Egypt.
At dawn on November 2, 1942, the Egyptian sky was still gray from the smoke of the previous night. The sun was rising slowly, but not its usual golden, soothing hue. Today, the sun was the color of blood. The air smelled of hot metal and burning gasoline. As far as the eye could see, the plain was littered with the bodies of burnt tanks, shattered trucks, and bodies covered in soiled cloth. A heavy silence had fallen over the desert, but this silence was the beginning of the final wave of the attack. Montgomery, who had been in his command post for 5 days straight, now stared, eyes red from sleeplessness, at a map showing the route of the new attack. "The time has come. We must break through to the north. They are weakened. Their ammunition is running out. If we attack tonight, their line will be broken by dawn." The operation had a symbolic name, Operation Supercharge, the final blow that was to finish Rommel off. The situation in the German camp was critical. Rommel, barely recovered from his illness, was now bent over a map, tracing with his finger a possible retreat route. His eyes were sunken, his face dry and dusty. The sound of tanks running out of fuel echoed in his ears. "General, we only have fuel for another 48 hours. The artillery is out of ammunition," said the logistics officer. "And I have to stand against the entire British Empire in this condition?" Rommel laughed bitterly. But he had not yet given up hope. "Concentrate everything we have in the north. If we can counterattack, perhaps we can buy time. We will hold out until the end." 2100 on November 2nd. A strong wind blew from the Mediterranean. The sands swirled in the air, but beneath the yellow storm, thousands of British soldiers were forming up in silence. The sound of tank engines roared in the distance. The documentary camera panned overhead, lines of pale blue light on the sand, the trail of the tank's shrouded lights, and the narrator's voice. In the darkness of the night, history was being written. Every move, every command determined the fate of a continent. At 0000, Montgomery said in a quiet but firm voice, "Begin." Suddenly, the silence was broken. Hundreds of cannons opened fire simultaneously. The ground shook underfoot. The orange light of the fire lit up the sky. British Sherman and Churchill tanks, with the light of explosions on their armor, emerged from the smoke like steel ghosts. Among them, New Zealand and Australian tanks advanced. The sound of the wireless echoed through the air. The advance has begun on the northern axis. Resistance is heavy. High casualties, but the advance continues. On the German side, the ground was shaking. The artillery was going off one after the other. Rommel, his eyes filled with worry, emerged from his trench and stared at the horizon. The officer on guard shouted, "General, the northern flank is under heavy fire. The Italians are retreating." Rommel shouted, "No! Hold out to the last bullet!" But it was too late. The Italians, exhausted by the lack of water and ammunition, abandoned their positions. The defensive line in the north was broken. Montgomery, who heard this from the command center, said quietly, "This is the point. Press on to the last moment." On the morning of November 3rd, the battle reached its climax. The El Alamein desert had become a veritable hell. The sound of the Wellington and Boston bombers echoed in the sky, their shadows sliding across the ground like black clouds. They flew at low altitude, targeting German columns. The ground shook with explosions. Panzer tanks rolled one after another in the smoke. Crews jumped out of their tanks and ran across the hot sand, aimless, helpless, searching for shade where there was none. A British pilot later said, "From above, the Egyptian desert looked like a scorched planet. Everywhere you looked, there was fire and smoke. Even from the sky, you could tell there was no place to live down there." At noon that day, Rommel received a message from the German command. The order from Berlin was, "No retreat allowed. Fight to the last man." He read the paper, then tore it up with a slow movement and said, "Berlin doesn't know this place. They haven't felt the heat of this hell." "We are destroyed," he told his officers. "I will not let my men die in vain. We will retreat." This decision determined the fate of the battle. On the afternoon of November 3rd, the remaining German and Italian forces retreated westward. Tanks were left without fuel, the infantry trudged through the sand. Many had gone days without water or food. The unit flags fluttered in the wind, dusty and tattered. Montgomery looked down from the heights over the battlefield. He did not laugh. Victory tasted bitter to him. "No victory in war is real. There are only fewer dead on one side," he muttered. But he knew that history would mark this day as a turning point. El Alamein was not just a military victory, it was the shattering of Rommel's legend. A few weeks later, Allied forces entered North Africa from Morocco and Algeria, cutting off Rommel's path. The Axis armies in Africa were defeated, and the way was open for the invasion of Italy. The documentary's final scene. The camera pans across the endless desert. In the background, the narrator's voice. At El Alamein, the sands still smell of gunpowder. The sound of the tanks has died down, but their echoes remain in history. There, amidst fire and wind, men fought who believed that the future could be built from the heart of the desert. But no one wins in the desert, only the survivors. The camera moves up. The vast desert shines in the sunlight. A caption appears on the image. The Battle of El Alamein, 1942, the turning point in the Desert War.
On the morning of November 4, 1942, the desert smelled of death again. A wind blew from the sea, and a mournful howl echoed through the sand dunes. On the horizon, smoke still rose from the half-burnt bodies of tanks. The sun had risen, but it no longer shone. British soldiers walked slowly through the remains of the battle. Every step they took sank into the soft sand, and every few meters they saw a body that had become one with the earth. One of the officers wrote quietly in his notebook, "Victory no longer means anything here. Both sides have left something of their humanity in this sand." The documentary camera pans over the ruins of the battle. Tanks with their turrets detached, trucks half-burnt, and helmets buried in the sand. The narrator's voice comes in the background. On the morning after the battle, the desert fell silent. A silence not of peace, but of world weariness. In the German camp, General Erwin Rommel sat on an iron chair. Before him lay a torn map, wet with sweat and sand. His face was pale. His eyes no longer had the sparkle that they had once had. His officers stood around. A heavy silence reigned among them. "Everything we had is gone," Rommel said. "No fuel, no supplies, no will to fight. We are just a shell of an army." Then he lowered his head and continued, "This is the end of a dream, the dream of an empire in the desert." One of the young officers tried to console him. "But General, we can still retreat to Libya and defend it there." Rommel gave him a bitter look. "Defense? With what? With these tired men? With tanks that no longer move? No, we are just buying time." At the same time, in London, Churchill sat at his desk with a faint smile. He had just received the final report on the Battle of El Alamein. He closed his eyes and muttered, "Before El Alamein, we had no victories. After El Alamein, we will have no defeats." Then he turned to his aide and said, "Tell the people, this is not the beginning of the end, but the end of the beginning." These words would later go down in history. El Alamein was not only a military victory, but also a spiritual turning point for the British people. The people who had only heard news of defeat until that day now had new hope. But on the battlefield, hope meant nothing. Wounded German soldiers groaned in the hot sun. British relief units came to their aid, giving them water and bandages. There was no hatred on any of their faces, only exhaustion, only a shared suffering. An Australian doctor wrote in his notebook, "When you look into the eyes of the prisoners, you realize that the real enemy is none of us. The enemy is war itself." In the northern Egyptian desert, a convoy of British armored cars drove with victory flags. On the military radio, a commander said in a tired but proud voice, "This day will be remembered. The Axis forces have been driven out of Africa. We held El Alamein." But the same commander wrote in his diary in private, "I think about the future, of the Italians, of Germany, of all Europe. If every victory has such a price, can the world endure peace?" In Berlin, the news of the defeat at El Alamein struck like a bolt of lightning through the Reichstag. An enraged Hitler tore down the map of Africa from the wall and shouted, "Rommel has betrayed! He should have stayed! He should have fought!" His generals stood in silence. No one dared to speak. A few days later, a secret message was sent to Rommel: either resist or destroy yourself. But Rommel would no longer listen. He had made up his mind: retreat to Libya until there was nothing left to lose. In the following weeks, the Allies entered Libya. Tripoli fell. Rommel counterattacked repeatedly, but his army was no longer strong. In February 1943, he returned to Germany, not as a hero, but as a broken man. In later reports, he wrote, "In the desert, I realized that victory no longer meant anything. War takes everything from a man, even his faith in the cause he is fighting for." The documentary camera returns to the present day. In the deserts of El Alamein, the remains of the battle can still be seen: rusting shells, half-buried armor, and mass graves marked by simple crosses. A gentle breeze blows, and the small British and German flags flutter side by side in the Memorial Museum. The narrator's voice ends by saying, "In Al Alamein, the world looked at itself twice, once in the mirror of pride, and again in the eyes of death. And perhaps in that brief moment, mankind understood that there is no honor in ashes." The camera rises over the tombs, over the golden sands, through the silence of the desert. The sound of the wind howls again, and the image slowly fades. On the screen, the last sentence appears: El Alamein, 1942. The desert remembered everything.
November 1942 to summer 1943. The sound of the cannons that fell at El Alamein sent ripples across Europe and the Mediterranean, not just mechanical waves of explosion and smoke, but political, strategic, and psychological waves that transformed borders and commanders' calculations. The Battle of El Alamein quickly grew from a local skirmish in the Egyptian desert to a defining event that would shape the fate of the Southern European front. 1. A victory that created opportunity. As Montgomery stood on a hilltop overlooking the scorched plain, he knew that physical victory, the pushback of Rommel, was only part of the outcome. The larger outcome was the opportunity that was created for the Allies, a chance to open a new front in southern Europe, to pressure Italy, and ultimately to cut off the Axis supply line in Africa. This opportunity was quickly realized. A few days later, in northwest Africa, American and British forces landed on the coasts of Mauritania, Algeria, and Morocco in Operation Torch, November 8, 1942, an operation that would have been impossible or too risky if El Alamein had failed. The combination of the attack from the west and Montgomery's pressure from the east tightened the strategic noose around Rommel's command, effectively encircling him and eventually forcing him to retreat. 2. The failure of Axis logistics, a strategic weakness. Allied operations by sea and air meant that Italian and German supply lines to their forces in Libya and Tunisia were cut off. Fuel ships were hit, convoys in the Mediterranean were targeted, and the Axis advance depots were left empty. El Alamein demonstrated that Rommel's tactical superiority in maneuverability, when not properly prepared, could not withstand concentrated pressure. The shortage of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts broke the backbone on which Rommel had relied. This logistical dilemma had a major message. Modern warfare was increasingly a war of supply lines, not just frontline warfare. Countries with access to the sea and reliable supply routes could ensure the sustainability and continuity of operations, and El Alamein made this clear to all. 3. Redefining the strategic geography of the Mediterranean.
With the Axis withdrawal from Egypt and the subsequent Allied takeover of North Africa, the Mediterranean Sea had become a more manageable route for the Allies, from a dangerous area to a more manageable route. This meant that the Allies could push through the Mediterranean to Sicily and then Italy. This was the route that Field Marshal Montgomery and other commanders saw as the right one for the invasion of Europe in the summer of 1943. The conquest of North Africa eventually opened the southern door to the heart of Europe, a path that led to the landings in Sicily and then Italy. 4. Psychological and propaganda impact. The death of the Rommel legend. The Battle of El Alamein dealt a psychological blow to the Axis that may not have been measured in immediate statistics and casualties, but was decisive throughout the war. Rommel, the Desert Fox, had been a symbol of wonder and invincibility for the Germans and their allies before El Alamein. The defeat in the sands of Egypt shattered that symbol. Allied public opinion was able to breathe new life into it and instilled in millions of homes the hope needed to continue the war. In Germany, the defeat in Africa was the starting point for doubts about leadership and strategic decisions. On a global scale, El Alamein sent a clear message that the Axis could be stopped on one front and then driven back. This message had a profound effect on the spirit of national resistance. The Allies were no longer just defending, they were planning to attack the heart of Europe. 5. Military repercussions on the Italian and Balkan fronts. After El Alamein and the Allied control of North Africa, the way was open for the invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, July 1943. The landing in Sicily was the beginning of the Allied pressure on the Italian front, an operation that also shook Italian domestic politics and ultimately led to the fall of Mussolini in July 1943. Italy, which had previously been considered a relative ally and Germany's mainstay in the Mediterranean, was effectively deprived of independent political power by the arrival of the Allies, forcing Germany to transfer forces from other fronts to Italy to stop the advance. This shift of forces was costly for the Germans. It divided resources and reduced the concentration of forces on other critical fronts, especially the Eastern Front, which together with Allied pressure ultimately led to the erosion of the Reich's combat capability. 6. Allied diplomacy, greater coordination in mutual support. The simultaneous operations of El Alamein and Torch demonstrated the growing coordination among the Allies. Washington, London, and Moscow now understood that success required a division of labor and a comprehensive approach. Britain would maintain pressure in one area, the United States would bring in fresh troops and equipment, and the Soviet Union would apply maximum pressure on Germany from the east. This coordination also made possible other arrangements, attacks on the Mediterranean islands, planning for Normandy, and the creation of auxiliary fronts that simultaneously increased pressure on the Axis. El Alamein served as a spark that accelerated the engine of Allied strategic cooperation. 7. POWs, abandoned equipment, and economic consequences. The Axis losses and POWs in North Africa, and especially after the retreat to Tunisia, were not only military in nature, they also affected the war economy. The capture of hundreds of armed forces, including tank crews and pilots, and the release of equipment that was either destroyed or left unused, had a long-term impact on the Axis offensive capacity. On the other hand, the Allies were able to recover, rebuild, and use some of this equipment, or gain access to human resources by receiving POWs. 8. Impact on the internal politics of the Axis countries. The collapse of the African front showed in a way that the Allied governments could not afford to rely entirely on the Reich. In Italy, military and economic pressures created cracks in the fascist leadership that led to the fall of Mussolini and a change in Italian political direction, which seriously reduced Germany's capacity to exploit Italian territory. These events, combined with subsequent defeats, set the stage for a series of political military crises for the Axis. 9. Implications for German strategy.
division of attention and resources. Germany, which had devoted a large portion of its combat and logistical strength to the east before El Alamein, suddenly found itself faced with the need to reinforce its southern front. The transfer of forces and the provision of second lines of support reduced the ability to plan major operations in the east. This division of resources, combined with political military pressure, ultimately contributed to Germany's strategic attrition, setting the stage for subsequent defeats at Kursk and later on the Allied recovery routes. 10. Military and educational lessons for the future. El Alamein taught important lessons to military academies and future commanders. The importance of supplies and resources in long-term operations, the effectiveness of mining and deterrent measures in defending broad lines, the need for coordination between infantry, armor, and air power for successful penetration, and the importance of intelligence, air reconnaissance, and naval support capabilities in distant fields. 11. The human narrative of survivors and the formation of collective memory. On a human level, El Alamein produced memories that were reflected in Allied literature, film, and historiography for many years. The British, Australian, New Zealand, Indian, and African soldiers who took part in the battle brought with them stories of suffering and courage. On the other hand, the narrative of Rommel and the Axis soldiers, of scarcity, masculinity, and collapse, was later reread in textual form by German and Italian historians. This collective memory not only analyzed the war, but also shaped national identity and post-war narratives. 12. Conclusion. El Alamein as a gateway to history. In short, El Alamein paved the way for the Allies' reconquest of southern Europe. The battle, which took place in the sands of Egypt, had an impact beyond its geography. It shattered the Axis forces, spread the conflict around the Mediterranean, and paved the way for the Allies to conquer Sicily and enter Italy. El Alamein is recorded in history as the point from which the waves of Allied victory rolled into Europe. This victory demonstrated that modern warfare is not simply a battle of equipment and tactics, but the product of coordination, logistical diligence, diplomatic policymaking, and ultimately, human will. And at the end of this section, the dramatic image of the desert emerges. The sands are calm, but the tracks of wheels, trenches, and battlefield scars still remain in the heart of the earth, marks that remind us that any local battle can change the fate of a continent.
After the victory at El Alamein, the hot sands of the Egyptian desert were no longer the same. A temporary lull allowed the soldiers to breathe, but the memory of the explosions, smoke, and death was still etched in everyone's eyes. The battlefield, with its half-burned tanks, crushed trucks, and bodies buried under the sand, was a reminder of the most brutal realities of war. Allied soldiers, from the British to the Australians and New Zealanders, walked through the ruins. Each one carried with him a memory of the death of a friend and comrade who had been lost in a brief moment. One infantryman wrote in his diary, "The sound of the explosions still rings in my ears, even as I look out over the silence of the desert." 1. Axis retreat and pressure on the European front. Rommel and his troops, returning to Libya, found that the Battle of El Alamein had not only changed the North African front, but also affected Germany's focus in Europe. To maintain supply lines and supplies in the Mediterranean, Germany was forced to transfer fresh forces from the east and north of Europe. This division of resources reduced German combat power on the Eastern Front and paved the way for an Allied offensive in other parts of Europe. The Axis generals in Berlin sat anxiously at their wooden tables. The charts and maps were full of red lines and arrows of retreat. One officer said in a trembling voice, "We must reorganize, or we will lose all of Africa." But Rommel, exhausted and defeated,
only nodded. 2. The human and psychological reflections of war. The British soldiers who took part in El Alamein experienced fear, courage, and solidarity. They received real military training day and night in the desert, under the scorching sun and sandstorms. Many of them later wrote that seeing their wounded and dead comrades had brought their morale to the limit. On the other hand, Axis soldiers wrote with anger and anxiety about the retreat. We are not defeated, but our spirits are broken. Every step back is a reminder of the mistakes of command. 3. The importance of intelligence and reconnaissance. One of the key lessons after El Alamein was the importance of accurate intelligence and aerial reconnaissance. The RAF had been able to monitor Axis movements well and, by informing the ground forces, launch effective attacks. This coordination between air and ground forces made the difference between victory and defeat. Indian and Australian soldiers on the front lines knew that every small decision could save hundreds of lives. Tanks and artillery moved precisely on the basis of information received, and every small mistake could have caused disaster. 4. Global repercussions. The impact on diplomacy and Allied unity. The victory at El Alamein was reported with enthusiasm in London and Washington. Governments and the media highlighted the battle as a turning point in World War II. Churchill famously said, "Operation in the desert not only took back the land, it restored hope." The United States, seeing the success of the Allies in North Africa, made a greater commitment to the entry of troops and equipment into the Mediterranean. The Soviets also benefited from the psychological and diplomatic pressure of this victory, and were able to continue their pressure on the German Eastern Front. 5. Reconstruction and preparation for the invasion of Europe. After El Alamein, the Allies quickly rebuilt their forces. Field hospitals were completed, equipment was repaired, and fresh troops were trained. This preparation paved the way for the invasion of Sicily and then Italy. British soldiers who had experience in the desert entered subsequent operations with greater confidence. Commanders knew that any attack without careful preparation could result in heavy casualties. 6. Personal memories and accounts. Survivors of El Alamein later told their stories in books and documentaries. One Australian soldier said, "Every time I see the desert sands, the sounds of the explosions and screams ring in my ears again. But we learned not to lose hope, even in the worst of circumstances." On the other hand, a German officer wrote, "Our defeat in the Egyptian desert was not only the defeat of tanks and artillery, it was the defeat of faith in invincibility." 7. The legacy of El Alamein. More than a battle, the operation at El Alamein became a symbol of courage, coordination, and the importance of intelligence and logistics. The soldiers, commanders, and ordinary people who helped in the background played a significant role in shaping this success. Soldiers and officers later gathered in museums and memorials to keep the memory of the war and its lessons alive. El Alamein reminds future generations that victory in war is the result of a combination of individual courage, careful strategy, and teamwork.
In the summer of 1943, the sun shone on the Mediterranean and the calm waves hid the brutality of war. But beneath the apparent calm, thousands of Allied soldiers, ships, and equipment were ready to land on the island of Sicily. This operation, codenamed Husky, was the beginning of the Allied direct push into southern Europe and the heart of Italy. 1. Preparation and planning.
After the success in North Africa and the Axis retreat to Tunisia, Allied commanders had the opportunity to plan a large-scale amphibious operation. Montgomery and the American forces worked closely together to divide the attack routes.